Welcome to the 61st episode of the Hail Married podcast. I'm A. Toves, and I'm joined by my husband, the Toves. We're back to recap the disappointing loss to Army. Before we get started, I wanted to give a shout out to my coworkers that attended the game. Thanks for joining us. I hope you guys had a great time and enjoyed the game day atmosphere. Clearly the Army fans did. So let's get started. I predicted a defensive showdown, and instead I got a defensive letdown. Army's offense started off fast and imposed its will on UTSA's defense, draining the clock while methodically marching downfield to score a touchdown. On the second offensive play, Kavorian Barnes fumbled for a second consecutive game. Army capitalized on the turnover, scoring a touchdown a few plays later. UTSA responded on the next drive as Robert Henry scored his first rushing touchdown as a Roadrunner. Army added a pair of field goals on their next two drives, but UTSA answered back as Eddie Lee threw up a 46-yard Hail Mary pass that Tyke Ogle-Kellogg caught in the end zone to bring UTSA within 6 at the half. UTSA attempted to mount a comeback in the second half, adding 2 touchdowns, the first from a 44-yard pass to Josh Cephas, and the second on an impressive 72-yard pass to freshman Devin McEwen. The defense was finally able to get 2 stops, but it was just too little, too late. Army added 2 impressive touchdowns of their own in the second half, along with a field goal to secure the 37-29 win. Army now leads the series 3-1. What are your thoughts on the game?
Well, first of all, it's going to be tough for you on Monday morning, since I think the coworkers that were there are probably going to rib you a little bit about this loss, right?
Maybe.
But yeah, no, overall, I thought it'd be a grinded out game that UTSA was going to control the line of scrimmage on both sides of the ball, just kind of fluster Army, a little bit like they did last season. But I was right. It was just the other way around. Army did that to us. And, I thought last season was a turning point against Army. I thought there had been lessons learned, and those lessons were brought together for a much better game plan against Army. And it just didn't seem to really kind of carry over to this year.
Yeah.
And that's really what I based a lot of my predictions on, was just how Army came out the first 2 games of the season and then how they played in last season's game. It's just the same old Army pushing UTSA around the dome like they did the previous 2 times they were here. And, look, Coach Monken admitted as much. His post-game quote was, "Our guys want to line up and knock people around and knock them off the ball." It's exactly what they did.
Yep.
And I do also want to say that UTSA fans keep mentioning that, this Army offense is unique, that there's all these little wrinkles to it, and Coach Traylor kind of plays into it too. But I mean, it was really just going up the middle. Really, it was a lot of just in between tackle running.
Yeah.
And it was just them pushing us around. Just like I said, Coach Monken had said that this is what his offensive line wanted to do, and his offense just in general wants to do. So what is it about this offense? Is it the threat of the option play? Because there really weren't that many option plays in this game.
I think the thing that is different about Army, even today, is the fact that they are willing to go for it so many times on 4th down. You would see our defense get a 3rd down stop, and then it was almost like, oh, the sigh of relief, because any other team would punt or go for a field goal. But not Army. Army plays 4 downs. I mean, they got 6 out of 6 4th down attempts, and I think that's the thing that makes them unique, if you will. It's not so much the type of offense they're running anymore. I mean, it's kind of just that smash mouth right down the center, like you said.
Yeah.
And they're not the only team that does that. They're one of the teams that probably does it with the most discipline, though. And then again, going for 4th down are the things that I think just wear a defense down, because mentally you're so used to, I got the 3rd down stop, good, get off the field, and that's just not how you play against Army.
Yeah, and that's fair enough. Look, I don't think that there was necessarily any sort of trick to Army's offense, but I also
other
think
than the trick play that we used last year, it was like they took our trick play, the double pass against us. But other than that, yeah.
Well, that's fair. But I still think that, they weren't going to go for it on 4th down very often. But the fact that they were just pushing us around rather easily made that decision just that much easier for them. And to be honest, they don't want to get put behind, not so much behind the line of scrimmage. I mean, I hear that a lot, but they don't want to get behind the scoreboard, because that means now they're having to start to chase. And I think that that's really what playing against Army is like. You have to get on top of them, or else they're going to control the entire game, and now you're in trouble because now you can't control anything.
Which is very true, because it's not that they can't score quickly. They can, and they have, but they like to dominate the clock, and they like to take their time and kind of ground, have that ground game to get 20, 30, 50 plays,
Yeah.
And, it seems like it's 50 plays every time they go for a touchdown. But on that flip side, you look at a team like UTSA, and obviously we can score quickly. We only had possession of the ball for 15 minutes, and we managed to score 29 points, but that's not how Army plays. So if you get ahead of them and they're coming from behind, they're uncomfortable. And that's sort of what happened a little bit in the game last year in West Point. We kind of forced them to have to play a different type of offense. They had to score quicker by passing, and that this game they really just controlled the tempo of the game. They got to play their style of ball, and we were the ones trying to catch up.
I went back to look at our notes from previous podcasts, and I went back to 2020. I went back to 2020 for this. And it still stings because it says UTSA hung around, but Army is underestimated due to their focus on discipline. Errors are magnified against a team like Army. I guess some things just never change, because you mentioned right now, you've talked about what it's like to play against Army, and Kavorian Barnes, second play, offensive play here, he fumbles.
Yep.
And it felt like that was the game, which is weird because we're literally, I think, 8-9 minutes into the game,
right,
and now we're already calling it potentially game over. It feels, again, weird to say, but man, that was such a killer for us.
Absolutely. But we do have to talk about the positives. I know we're going to get into it later on, but can I say, I think this is the first time we're going to talk about a Hail Mary pass on the Hail Mary podcast. I mean, come on.
It was, I called it. I said, I think Eddie Lee can definitely get it into the end zone, but I felt like as soon as I saw both teams line up, it felt like Army was playing it weird. It's like, what are you doing? Why? It felt like the Jennifer Lawrence thing that everybody puts on their TikTok videos.
Right.
What do you mean? What do you mean? Because their linebackers kind of stayed, and it's like, why are you keeping your linebackers so close to the line of scrimmage, or at least not that far from the line of scrimmage? Because it doesn't matter if Eddie Lee takes off. That's a 50-yard scramble he's got to make.
Yeah.
More importantly, you have to defend the pass. And I talked about, and we'll get into it when we talk more about the keys to the victory, but yeah, it was just a perfect pass, middle of the field. And then even after the touchdown, they have a shot of Jeff Monken, on the sidelines, and he looks like he's looking at his defensive assistant saying,
what just
happened? That's not how we defend the Hail Mary pass. And,
right,
what were we thinking? Because it really looked like it was just a deep shot, a deep post to Tyke.
Yeah,
it was just a great pass.
Tyke, Mr. Potential, comes up big. These are the moments that at times are just so frustrating about Tyke, because you see this and you know that he has the ability to be great. But again, we just see these flashes,
Well, and then we'll talk about toughness here in a second, but he essentially took on 3 or 4 secondary
right,
players and willed his way into the end zone. I mean, sure, the momentum was taking him in there, but he just laid back and he's in. So, yeah, great play. But unfortunately, like you said, much like Tyke, there was just flashes of things.
And I think, thinking about the American right now, if Army doesn't join the American, we're not going to see Army again until 2031. I feel like Jeff Traylor right now is on the phone to Mike Oresco telling him, no, I don't care what Army says, we don't want them. I don't want to see them again until 2031.
Well, you just brought up Jeff Traylor being on the phone with Oresco. Let's talk about Jeff Traylor's post-game comments.
Ooh, yeah.
Okay, so here's one of the comments. He's pondering after what he would have done if Eddie isn't sacked on UTSA's last offensive drive. He makes this eye-rolling and just really cringy response of, frustrating, man. There's got to be an easier way to make a living somewhere else. Are you kidding me? I've seen at least one person say this on X, but yes, Coach Traylor, there are different ways to make a living. but you don't get paid close to $3 million to do so.
Yeah. I mean, this is the thing that frustrates me about Coach Traylor, because, you know, you hear him talk about his culture. He has his culture pillars, very much likes to talk about culture pillar violations and, you know, using this because you have emotional young men who are out there playing football. There's highs and lows and kind of trying to keep them engaged and focused. But yet here he is in this press conference, clearly frustrated, which of course any coach would be upset and frustrated. But making comments like that again, it's like, you are supposed to be the leader. You are the one who sets the expectation with your culture. And yet this is what you're saying in a press conference. How am I supposed to feel confident that you are now going back into your locker room and you're setting the expectation for what needs to happen so that we're focused going into the Tennessee game, we're focused going into conference play? I mean, you talk about all of these different mantras every year, doesn't matter, get better. Like, I hope that Dr. Campos right now is like lining your office with all of your sayings, because I think they're really for him right now more than the team.
Absolutely. And, you know, it's curious because you brought this up last season.
Yeah.
You brought it up about his culture and how they needed to lean on their culture in order to get them to the tough times. And yet again, here we are. It looks like, oh, they're not doing that.
Yeah, I mean, culture is great in good times, but culture is extremely important when you get punched in the mouth. That's the thing that you rely on, and that should make the difference in how you react in the next game. So, you know, Coach Traylor, I get it, you're upset, but you got to take a moment, you got to get focused before these press conferences, because that comment is making its way all throughout Twitter. It got picked up by national media, and that is not the type of comment that epitomizes your culture, the triangle of toughness, your culture pillars. So, you know, hopefully he can get himself in line, you know, and he can listen to his own mantra and his own culture so that he can be the example for his team.
Well, and then again, like I mentioned, you mentioned this last year, but again, for the second year in a row, during non-conference, things are getting tough, and he gets in his feelings.
Yeah.
And I don't know. I mean, he just makes it so tough sometimes to really support him because of the fact that he just gets so emotional.
Yeah.
And when we look at some of these games, when we look at how tight some of them are, you know, I marvel at why we are able to win those, because we do have an emotional coach and we have emotional players. And those emotional players, you know, cost themselves big because they make big mistakes in big games. So, look, in Conference USA, I think we were able to get away with them. I think in American Conference here, we're going to probably be able to get away with them again. But you just have to, as you said, exemplify. You are the leader. You're the parent. Show it. All right. Enough of that. Let's get to the defense.
Do we have to? Okay.
Yes, we do. All right.
So disappointing.
It was, but the keys for the defense were limit your over pursuit in the ball carriers and use the defensive line to create pressure on the quarterback. Look, neither of these came true because the front seven was usually in a pile on the ground. Look, it was a matter of toughness. Obviously, we have the triangle of toughness, which we've just mentioned right now. A lot of the, you know, that being the culture of the UTSA Roadrunner football team. But man, it's tough to talk about being tougher than the Army. Like, it's a conundrum for me, right? Because it feels like
you want the military to be the toughest thing in the country, right? Yeah.
I mean,
it's true.
There's a reason why these guys are enlisted, right? Because they're being essentially groomed to be the defense of our country, and UTSA is just, you know, playing defense for a game. Like, you know, There's just that mentality I think that the service academies have that, you know, it's just difficult. I just go back and forth. It's like I want to question the toughness of the UTSA team, but, you know, on the other hand, it's just, you know, I'm kind of rambling here, but, you know, it's just, I think this is how Jess Lett felt, because, you know, on one hand, we gave him credit, and then, like, I think gut reaction after this game to me was, man, what a terrible performance. Like, what is he doing? Like, I don't understand. Like, why isn't he making the right calls? But after you rewatch, I felt like they were much more. I mean, the calls were fine, but then you had guys that just weren't. He just didn't really have those guys, I guess, mentally disciplined. But I think it really, again, it goes back to what I said about the Army, where like these errors are just magnified. Like you miss an assignment, they take advantage.
Yeah.
Like and you have other teams that will. That's not where I'm going with this. But where I am going with this is that if you're not disciplined against the Army, then you're essentially playing into their hands, and it makes it easier for them to go on. But it had to be, like I said, demoralizing for Lev, mostly because, you know, I don't really know what he could have done to help his team, like, essentially stop the run. Like, there was just...
Yeah, I know it was about execution. It wasn't about
right. I mean, I think really what it comes down to, and I'm going to drop this one, everybody loves playing the military until you have to play them on the football field, and then you get so flustered because you're like, why? Like, why are we, like, behind? You know, why are we getting our butts kicked? You know, it's just the way it happens. Do you think we underestimated this Army offensive line at all?
Absolutely. I mean, again, I also thought the change of style of offense, you know, we saw them kind of not comfortable with that in their first game. They made some changes on the offensive line for injuries and so forth. So, again, you know, you're kind of thinking, okay, well, maybe we can take advantage of that.
Right.
And we didn't. You know, obviously, next man up mentality meant a little bit more to them than it did to us.
Well, I mean, again, it's the military, right? Like, it's one of those things where UTSA says it, but you don't always feel like they're going to mean it. Whereas with the military, it's just different, right? Yeah. They say it, and there's certainly truth to that. Like, that's how they feel. It doesn't matter who's there. We talked about already a little bit, like last year we kind of forced Army to play differently, right? We essentially sold out and we stopped the run. This year, I mean, again, it felt like we were trying to stop the run, but it was just the will that last year it didn't seem that Army had. But here's the deal, because Army was in the wishbone last year, and then we talked, or at least I remember talking about this in the podcast, that, you know, Coach Traylor and others said that, you know, the UTSA's plane was delayed for like multiple hours. They didn't get until real late into West Point. They didn't really get any walkthroughs. They didn't get to do any of that stuff. Yet they still went out there and were able to win in overtime against Army. This year, hey, they're all comfortable. Everything's good.
Yeah, we're at home. I mean, yeah, it was a Friday game, but I don't know. Maybe we lulled ourselves into thinking that, you know, because we had these two really great defensive games, that we were going to be able to just kind of dial it in a little bit or phone it in a little bit. I don't know. Well,
like you said, I mean, you know, they have some offensive linemen shifting around. So the thought is, you saw what they did against quote unquote really good Texas State, you know, offensive line. You saw what they did against a Houston line that is fine. I don't think is like fantastic. And you're like, I mean, they can't be that much better than neither one of those. So we'll be fine, right?
Yeah.
It wasn't the case.
Yeah, there's, you know, a couple of comments about tackling after the game, and it felt like when we were watching the game that the tackling was just awful. But then when you go back and look at the PFF scores, that's not really what the score said. Now, the linebackers did have very low tackling scores, particularly Jamal, Avery, Danye, and then Trumaine Bell, which obviously a D lineman, but those are the ones that I think kind of stood out because we're not used to seeing those linebackers have such low tackling scores. But really, kind of overall, the narrative was, you know, tackling was an issue, but when you look at some of our other position players, according to the PFF scores, they really weren't.
And I think the problem is that PFF, I don't know that it's able to grade whether you missed the assignment. So if you're not in the right spot, then of course you don't have an opportunity to miss a tackle, right? Like,
yeah,
you're out of there. So maybe that's why the tackling is a little bit higher. But, you know, certainly I think, you know, another thing that I saw and I learned during this game about this defense was that, you know, before I had said, hey, our secondary can't be lulled into not, you know, defending these wide receivers. And I said that like last season about this game. I was like, yeah, you know, what happens is all of a sudden you get sucked into watching everything in front of you and you forget that you got somebody that you should be watching. And this game, really exemplified that. Like, for some reason, we kept letting Army get behind us. We kept allowing all these things to happen. And it just felt like, I don't know that it was, again, to your point, anything schematically. It was just, we were pressed to make a play and make a stop because of the fourth down conversions. You know, you talked about it, 6 for 6, right? One other thing I want to mention is this is the worst time of possession we've ever had when we played against Army. 44 minutes, right? You know, back in 2019 was in the 30s, you know, as it was over the next 2 games. So, I mean, it's just, we were able to deal with it previously in other versions of this team. This team just wasn't able to capitalize that. One last thing, Trey Moore went down.
Yeah.
Do you think he even makes that much of a difference in this game? I mean, he was in there for a little while, but overall, do you feel like that's a huge...
I mean, it just didn't seem like he was getting to the quarterback before he went down, so I'm not sure how much of a difference he would have made, you know, the rest of the game if he had played. You know, it didn't seem that he was really that effective, but certainly it didn't help by any means.
Yeah, and hopefully he's okay. It looks like he was in a boot, but hopefully it's precautionary. Hopefully he gets held out of against Tennessee, and we just, you know, we see him in a few weeks against Temple. Last thought, just for everyone, you know, looking at this defense, I'm not necessarily demoralized. I'm just disappointed. It just felt like, you know, we just didn't get it done. You know, and it goes back to something you said before about the triangle, right? Like, we need to have all three parts of it.
Yep.
Didn't have it. This special teams, as we move there, did you feel like we had it there, or how did you feel about it overall?
You know, obviously the big thing on special teams that's going to stand out is that error on the onside kick with Rashad's illegal block. You know, that was certainly a momentum swing and came in a critical time. Other than that, you know, Dean was impressive on his punts. You know, we didn't have any field goals, so we didn't really get to see Chase Allen, but the kickoffs and the extra points were fine. So,
yeah, you know,
unfortunately, they didn't return any. Did they? Maybe returned one kickoff, I think. So,
you know, they don't have any like huge game breakers. Yeah. So, yeah, I don't think we were going to see many issues there. But this whole, you know, illegal block, you know, obviously it's Rashad. It's a single digit. Here we go again. We talked about it before. You know, critical mistakes by single digit players. And look, I get it. These single digit players are going to be on the field often because they're single digit players and they're the leaders of this team. But, you know, that it doesn't look good when these guys are the ones making the critical mistakes, right? Because usually they're also veterans and they should be the ones that shouldn't be making these mistakes. Right. All right. Let's go into an area that we thought was going to be a concern, but turned out to have some bright moments. I won't say it was perfect, but the offense. Keys to the game, take advantage of their short cornerbacks. Check on that on the Hail Mary, but overall, I don't think that was really a thing. And then lean on West Coast offensive concepts. We certainly did not do that. There was just way too many, again, I think uneven play calling, and we'll get into that a little bit more a little bit later. But, you know, I wasn't feeling too dissuaded by this team or this side of the ball, but I also was feeling like, I think 4 scoring drives this entire game seems like a great performance, but there was just something lacking. It felt like we didn't get enough out of some of the other drives.
Well, part of the problem is because of the defense, right? If we had gotten 4 scoring drives and the defense had played like they had against Houston and Texas State, it would have been fine. But, right. You know.
Right. And I guess that's the tough part about this, is that when you start kind of thinking about it and kind of going through it, you're like, you know, we could have gotten some more out of the offense. But give us some bright spots.
Yeah, again, very exciting to see 2 touchdowns scored by 2 new players to the team. Robert Henry gets his first touchdown. He's a JUCO transfer. And then true freshman Devin McCune gets his first touchdown. Gorgeous pass to him, 72 yards, I think. Yeah. And then he gets a 2-point conversion on top of that. So just incredible. We talked about Tyke earlier. You know, great to see him use his physicality to come up with that catch in the Hail Mary. And then or Hail Mary. So used to saying Hail Married. Again, we had to make some changes on the offensive line due to injury. Ernesto Almaraz moved from center over to guard. They put Luke Lopez in at center. There was one kind of low snap, but overall, once again, a great job from those two to see a new center come in earlier in the season with Ernesto, and then a second new center come in with Luke Lopez. I mean, that's a very critical position between, that relationship between them and the quarterback. And so it was great to see him, really do well in the first game. And then Ernesto Almaraz, I think, had the highest PFF scores out of all of the offensive line.
He was actually on the right tackle because Corey Gottenet was right guard. But yes, I would agree. Almaraz was not the guy I thought was going to be probably one of the most valuable members of the offensive line.
Right.
Not to say that I don't think he's talented. I just wasn't expecting him to have to shift around and yet still be effective wherever he went. So yeah, incredible flexibility from him. You're right on Lopez. Great to see him step in. Fine there. I think one of the problems though with the offensive line is they're having to hold up so much because of some of these calls, and because of it, you just get you have problems because you have to block for a while. But aside from that, I really felt like they played well. Just to add on to yours, anybody else in the offense that you thought maybe had any other really good games?
I mean, just overall seeing Rocco Griffin again, I thought, all of the running backs did well outside of the fumble from Kavorian, which we'll talk about that later. But, I mean, the offense seemed to flow better with Eddie Lee than we've seen in the first couple of games. So having Eddie Lee come in and be so poised in his first start, I thought was impressive. I mean, before the game, if you had told me that we were going to lose this game and Frank didn't play, I would have just assumed it was because, hey, this is Eddie Lee's first time starting. He's going to make some mistakes. These things happen. The defense probably played well, but it turned out I was completely off base. The defense struggled, and Eddie Lee just looked very poised. He didn't make any major mistakes. Sure, we can go back and there's, some opportunities and some errors that he made, but really nothing significant or costly. He looked very calm. He looked very composed. It was very impressive for someone coming in and starting the first time.
Yeah, so let's talk a little bit more about the quarterbacks then, because, you mentioned Eddie Lee looking poised. The one drive that impressed me most about him was that Hail Mary pass at the end of the first half, because you had a small amount of time, and sure, he completes the Hail Mary, but he put the offense in a position to give him a chance to throw that ball there at the end of the first half, as opposed to potentially, eating it or just making some bad decisions and not doing so. And you're right, like as he was going on that drive, I'm watching him, and even on the rewatch, he didn't look phased.
Yeah.
And I think that that's why I like your point about that. It just didn't look phased at all, and just kind of stared down the Army defense and said, okay, no problem. I'm going to take us down and we're going to score. And it sounds weird to say, right? Because all the momentum is over there with Army. It's 20-7. There's just no way. And then Eddie Lee happens and Ty Key, right? Look, I think overall in terms of this offense, the reason I think that Eddie Lee also looked comfortable and poised was because that's who Justin Burke has been coaching since the spring.
Right.
That's who's been taking most of the snaps, along with Owen McCown. And I think Owen still, from what I saw in the spring, I think is still a better quarterback from what I saw of him. But you can't be mad at Eddie Lee and what he did. And I think that's the interesting thing, right?
Yeah, certainly if Eddie ends up being the weaker of the two, then we're in a great position.
I don't think there's anything that we can be mad about in terms of what I think is going into conference, right? Like, I look at conference play and I'm like, look, if we go in there and play Eddie Lee or Owen, I feel fine. And I think that kind of brings up something like a little bit of a Frank Harris problem, right? Because of the fact that, yes, he's injured, but him being injured means he's also not practicing.
Right.
Means he's not getting time with these receivers. And that's still more time that Eddie Lee and Owen are getting with the receivers. And when you see them take some deep shots the way they did and Eddie Lee hits them, there's a reason why the offense looks more explosive, because he's used to seeing these guys go down the field. And, I mean, Eddie Lee's got an arm. I mean, I said it before. He's got an arm. He didn't prove me wrong here. Like, he showed it off a few times. So, overall, I think in the quarterback room, like I said, and it's tough, right? You respect Frank, but I think it's going to be difficult to see him come back on the field not having had that connection that these two guys have. And it's like, at some point, I know it's sacrilegious to say, but it's going to be a tough decision for Justin Burke and Jeff Traylor to figure out. I mean, if these guys are winning, do we have to rush Frank back, or do we just keep rolling with these guys? I mean, again, it's one game sample, of course, but you see that comfort, and it's the way you used to see Frank V last year. So
yeah,
I don't know. I mean, it's certainly something just to throw out there. Let's see what happens. Hopefully Frank gets better, and if Frank is better than even Eddie Lee performed in this game, again, like you said, we're going to be fine. All right, let's talk real quick about play calling. I just felt like, look, I get it. I think we've been beating this to death, and this may be the last time I really go after this. I say that, but I probably won't. But I just don't understand some of the concepts we have. A lot of it is slow routes. There's a lot of just runs up the middle and then bubble screens. Runs up the middle, bubble screens. There are good moments from Justin Burke. I'm not going to say that there isn't. However, it just starts feeling predictable. Like, we're just doing the same thing over and over because that's what Frank is comfortable with. And then you kind of see him do it with Eddie Lee. But then in this game, you still see some of the concepts of, you've got receivers running deeper routes, especially on that last offensive play where you see guys going up the field and there's nobody for Eddie Lee to like really dump off to. And the problem right here is not just there's nobody to jump off to. It's that you look like you're playing for the tie as opposed to just getting that first down. It was 3rd and 7. All you had to do is get a manageable 4th down, 4th and 5, 4th and 3.
Right.
Now the offensive playbook's a little bit more opened up, and you're like, you've got some options, right? But instead of, again, playing for it, we're going for that big play. And that's another thing that Army does, is I think that Justin Burke started panicking and started running some longer routes, because Jeff Traylor said it post-game. We thought we had a deep shot on that. It's 3rd and 7. Why would you try to go for a deep shot? I get that you fooled them before, but just get the first down. You want to frustrate them more? Get a first down.
Right.
Continue piling up these first downs and put yourself in a position to tie the game. Again, I think that Justin Burke and this offense looks a little bit better because he's working with the quarterbacks that he's worked with since the spring, right? Do you feel like there's anything there that that I'm not seeing?
Well, I think the other thing that we're still missing, last season we were really worried about our offensive line and their health. And because of that, we had Frank throwing a lot of passes, kind of attacking in the middle so that he could get the passes out quickly. Same type of situation this year, right? We're shuffling guys around on the offensive line, but yet we're throwing the deep pass and we're forcing the offensive line to try to hold up longer so that Eddie can let that, route develop. Why aren't we doing what we did last year and trying to take those shorter passes, like you said, so we can dump it off to somebody in the middle? Army wasn't defending the middle a lot of times, but there wasn't a receiver running around there. So it just seems like, again, we have some other opportunities to take advantage of the fact that we still have some injuries on the offensive line. We need to help Eddie, Frank, whoever it is, get these passes out quickly so that we can sustain these drives.
It's a great point. Because if we start attacking the middle, now we're forcing the defense to guard us the entire field.
Yeah.
Right now, we're just having them try to just guard. Essentially, they're leaving the middle open and going, we dare you. And Burke is not running any routes in there. And if he is, he's making it much more difficult for our receivers to do so. So still work to do on the offense, but I think it looks better with either Owen or Eddie Lee. I mean, obviously, I think you keep rolling with Eddie Lee until he shows you something different.
Right.
But for me, I think, I wouldn't be surprised if Owen gets some time against Tennessee.
Sure.
And I think it would be good for the team. I think it's good, not because I don't want to give Eddie Lee any more confidence, but I think having these two ready to play is going to be crucial going into conference. All right. Any last things that we learned about this offense? Because we've brought up quite a few points.
Well, the one thing, again, we've got to work on and keep an eye on, I guess, is just Kevorian Barnes and his issue fumbling. 2 games in a row, single digit. He had a little bit of problem at the beginning of the year, in 2020, the beginning of the year, and got benched. Hopefully this is just an anomaly and not something that we're going to continue to see.
For UTSA fans, just as a comparison, a senior wide receiver, a star player really for Army, Ajuan Marshall, who's played us, was benched because he fumbled, essentially ends up 3 times total, but a crucial one against Delaware State, right? Delaware State and FCS, Kevorian last year against Texas Southern, right? But Jeff Monken talked about in his presser pre-game, or actually during the week before the game, said, hey, we have to go with somebody else because he's costing us. And look, I'm not saying that Kevorian has to be completely benched, because he was benched for a while.
Yeah.
But there is something to say is bring in Robert Henry, bring in Rocco Griffin, and, let's let Kevorian have to compete back for this job, because I feel like if we don't, to your point, I think people have seen how Kevorian handles the ball. It's a little too loosey-goosey, and because of it, we're going to have problems.
We just need to work with him and figure out what the issue is so that he can fix it. I'm sure he can fix it.
Yeah, and let's hope he does. But otherwise, run game I thought was good. I mean, right? 22 carries for 121 yards. Thing is, when you have that, I think when you start pressing and you start feeling like you have to catch up in this game, you go away from your bread and butter, which is your running game, and you have to go to the passing game. And then we just already talked about the passing game. What some of the things going wrong there. So, any last thoughts on the offense or the overall game?
No, I think we covered everything.
All right,
let's talk about Tennessee. Interesting thing about Tennessee, kind of going into this season, I believe they were rated they were 9th in the nation the start of the season. They were 11th going into the game with Florida. They've now dropped to 23 after their loss. Don't get too excited, though, UTSA fans. This is still a very talented Tennessee, just not as highly rated as perhaps we thought at the beginning of the season we would be facing.
Yeah, I mean, I think of it like last year when we went into Austin. We're like feeling pretty good. Hey, this is a really good UTSA team. And then things fell apart for us. I think, that was a different team. That was at a different point. And this team here is kind of coming in with not as much momentum, I think, as was going into Austin. Mm-hmm. And this Tennessee team, not to talk them up so much, but yes, there's got some great team speed. It's SEC, right? It just means more. This is a true SEC team. Last year we played a pretty good Big 12 team. I think Texas is better this year, but this Tennessee team really, really has some players, and I think it's going to be difficult for both sides of the ball to have success against. Start with the offense, though. Joe Milton is our quarterback. He took over for Hendon Hooker. Milton is a big guy, and he's got sort of a cannon, but his accuracy at times leaves a little to be desired. Mm-hmm. Kind of reminds you of Donovan Smith. Kind of reminds you a little bit of TJ Finley. Guys that we've already kind of played against.
Right.
So while I think it kind of helps the defense a little bit, and I think the defense will perform better than they did against Army, there's still playmakers to talk about, like Squirrel White and Brew McCoy. Brew McCoy, who's went to Texas, went to USC. He's been all over the place. Looks like he finally found a home at another UT, this time Tennessee, right?
Right. I just love the name Squirrel White, too. Squirrel White going up against Pig Cage. I mean, I know they're not that wouldn't be the matchup, but it's just kind of funny, right?
Let's go. Let's get that matchup for me. Though, I think based on the names, I don't know that we're going to have success, right?
Maybe not, yeah.
But anyway, you get Jalen Wright at running back and Jabari Small, both talented players, both guys that I think can put up some yards on any defense, let alone this UTSA defense.
Yeah, Tennessee struggled to get the run game going at Florida, but they were very balanced when they played Virginia and Austin Peay earlier in the season. Part of the reason, too, it's hard to figure out which Tennessee offense we're going to get is because they really did struggle against Austin Peay. I mean, ultimately they won, but it really wasn't a great game for them. And when you're talking about struggling against an FCS program, that's a huge question mark. I mean, certainly they struggled against Florida, but Florida is now in the top 25. So it's kind of it's hard to make a whole lot of their schedule because you've had these two very different games.
We have this rivalry game that's coming up, and you just tend to look ahead, right? No matter what, as fans, we can look ahead. It's not going to affect us because we're not actually playing. But when the players start looking ahead, you usually end up having some problems. And that's exactly what Tennessee did. They looked ahead, and they underestimated Austin Peay, and they didn't really show up. And you just run into issues, right? And I mean, these guys, again, I'm talking about guys that are 18 to 24, maybe older.
Yeah.
Sorry, Frank. But really, I know. I'm just.
But I mean, you also have a new offensive coordinator at Tennessee. It's an internal promotion. Sound familiar?
Yeah.
But their offensive coordinator left and went to South Florida. So, it's still early in the season. They're working some things out as well.
Yeah, and then I think, going into this defense, there are opportunities there. I'm not going to say that, this Tennessee team is infallible. They've improved, but they do struggle with a pass defense. They've struggled against the last few opponents that they've had. Here's the deal, though. I mean, against Florida, they made Florida one-dimensional, but that's because their quarterback, Graham Mertz, had an injury. And I wasn't sure whether it's his passing hand, because they kept saying that it was his left hand because he had it wrapped. And then all of a sudden they were like, well, I think both hands are not doing well.
Yeah, like a cut on the other hand or something.
So, yeah, and Florida just had problems after that. Like, their offense didn't look the same once Mertz was kind of hobbled. But Tennessee really didn't take too much advantage on defense. Like, once again, there wasn't this swing there, but I still think that you've got Aaron Beasley, one of the top leading tacklers, with 20 tackles and 2 sacks on the season. This is not an easy venture for Jeff Traylor. So we talked about earlier how Jeff Traylor's kind of in his feelings. He's going to continue being in his feelings about this big matchup with Tennessee. All right, let's get to our keys to victory. and I'm doing this tongue in cheek, but look, I think we find some ways to sustain drives with play calling. That's really going to help us, especially if we sprinkle in some plays that we would certainly want to use against Temple. Yes, Temple and Tennessee are different, but I think there's an opportunity here for us to start working that game plan a couple weeks ahead of time. We did that against Texas Southern last year, which is an FCS opponent, and I get this is an SEC opponent, but if we really think that we're going to really pull off this upset, there's going to have to be some better execution, and there's going to have to be Justin Burke making some different play calls, or at least a better way to get our second key here, which is to get Eddie Lee in a good rhythm. I think Eddie Lee would thrive in having some of this attack in the middle of the field. I think he would thrive with some of these quicker passes because he's just a natural passer. There's just a pop to him when that ball comes out of his hand. Now, I think he needs to learn a little bit of touch because I think he throws a lot of 95-mile-per-hour fastballs at his receivers. But, that's just something that as he continues to gain experience, he'll be fine. On defense, stopping the run. It's going to be easier said than done, but I think this defense learned a lesson against Army, and I think they're going to have a little bit of a chip on their shoulder. That's not to say that I think that they completely shut down Tennessee, but I feel like if they do enough, might give us a little bit more of a chance to be more competitive in this game. Last year, Texas just ran it down our throat, and there is where we had the problems actually controlling the game there. And then trying to get pressure on Milton. There was a play where he got pressured by Florida, and he just decided to throw the ball anyway. Yeah. It was a terrible decision, and it ended up getting intercepted because it looked like he just kind of threw it up straight up in the air as opposed to trying to throw it downfield. And like I said, felt like a punt. So anyway, if we can get some pressure, I think this UTSA defensive line can do some damage. However, we'll see how things go out. I don't anticipate us trying to just heavily blitz Joe Milton, because I feel like that would just play into his hands for success. So let's get to our predictions. I'll go first this time. All right, look, I never thought this was a winnable game this season. All right, let's just get this out of the way. Even in the summer, I was like, nah. I mean, I'm just going to be happy if we go in there and perform well. And from what I've seen from the offense so far, I don't think there's really been a change for me in terms of this being winnable. I think obviously there's anything can happen, but there's going to have to be a lot of good luck and a lot of things change between now and game time on Saturday in Knoxville. I still think UTSA is a good team. I'm not discouraged. I think there might be a little bit of a rougher patch getting through conference. But otherwise, I really feel like Tennessee just has a roster depth that UTSA doesn't. Presumably, we're not going to have Frank Harris or Trey Moore, so that makes things just that much more difficult, right? But this inconsistent offense just leads me to believe that this will still be a little bit rough. I mean, that's just the way it's going to go. We'll have our moments, but ultimately, it's just not going to be enough. Give me Tennessee 45-13 over UTSA.
All right. Tennessee is having a tougher season than expected, but they're still a very talented team. Even if we had a healthy 2022 version of Frank Harris, I think this game would be very challenging. Certainly don't expect to see Harris play. I'd love to see the Roadrunner defense bounce back and the offense to play well enough to keep this competitive through the first half. I fully expect that Tennessee is going to come into this game with something to prove after losing to their rival Florida and then having this poor showing against an FCS program. If they do, this game could get out of control in the second half. And again, we might be able to see Owen play. Ultimately, for me, the goal is to get out of this game healthy-ish, and to be competitive, kind of likening it back to the first half of the UT game last season. So ultimately, I think Tennessee will win. I think the score will be somewhere around 34-17. Before we go, let's talk about some of the other scores from around the American Conference.
All right.
Temple beat Norfolk State 41-9. Kind of hard to gauge Temple at this point. Again, when you're looking at this big score, but against an FCS team, they lost to Rutgers the week before that. They'll have a Miami and Tulsa prior to playing UTSA, so it'll kind of give us a little bit of a better idea. I still don't quite know what to make of this Temple team just yet. Tulane beat Southern Miss 21-3. Michael Pratt's still out with an injury, but they seem to look and play pretty well even without him.
Yeah, it's impressive. It really is.
And then Rice beat Texas Southern 59-7. Is Rice back?
This is what happens when you get a good quarterback. And I mean, JT Daniels has been around for a while, but Bloomgren is essentially using his skills and putting them to good use here. So yeah, I mean, I think they're certainly going to be much more formidable than some of these other Conference USA schools that came up to the AAC.
Maybe not the cakewalk we're used to, huh?
Maybe not, yeah.
North Texas squeaked by Louisiana Tech 40-37. They started out really strong with their new quarterback, Chandler Rogers, but then they let Louisiana Tech mount this comeback in the fourth quarter and then had to rely on a walk-off field goal to win in typical UNT style.
Yeah, I mean, that North Texas defense still isn't very good. That's why they came back, is because North Texas just is not a good team.
But it does seem like they're maybe going to be in a better position with this new quarterback.
Okay.
We'll see.
Okay.
I know, we have a sample of one game, and it's Louisiana Tech. FAU played Clemson and lost 48-14. That is not unexpected in terms of the score. The thing that isn't unexpected was that Casey Thompson was hurt in the game. He is pending an MRI, could be out several weeks, might be out the entire season. So I think that's really going to kind of change the trajectory for FAU going forward. Yeah,
and look, I think that kind of changes also UTSA's trajectory. I mean, there was some concerns going in, potentially against FAU because FAU's is different, obviously Tom Herman's there. We'll see. Obviously, again, we'll see how they circle the wagons and get to their matchup against us. But certainly, it's looking like UTSA can still have a manageable schedule in conference.
Right. UAB lost to Louisiana 41-21. I read an article about the game that said UAB's defense couldn't stop a turtle. So I guess it's good to see that somebody else had a defensive struggle last week in conference play.
Here we go. We talked about Dilfer maybe not being that right guy. Maybe he is. But at first look, really rough start. For a guy that's a quarterback, for a guy that, knows all this stuff, things just aren't gelling well here.
Yeah, and on the offensive side, their O-line allowed 7 sacks on Zeno. So obviously it was pretty hard for him to get comfortable and get in a rhythm.
Yeah.
And then if you just want to have a laugh, there's a meme going around on X about the kicker after he had a kick go awry and kind of looking up into the stadium like, what just happened? So, you can look for that and have some laughs. Another game just to call out, we're not going to play Memphis this year, but Memphis and Navy played. Memphis won 28-24, but there were so many fumbles in that last fourth quarter. It just almost seemed like neither one of those teams wanted to win.
Yeah, they each kept saying, hey, here's your chance.
Take it.
Neither team took advantage.
Yeah, and then Charlotte. Wow. We knew that Biff Poggi was an interesting hire in the beginning of the season, but boy, is he melting down.
I mean, I'm speechless. If you have a chance, here we go again. We talked about this with UAB. Now we're talking about Charlotte, the ones that just had the 2 weirdest hires.
Right.
I don't understand. Poggi is saying now that he doesn't agree that his coaches put the players in the best position to win. After one of his players said, we just have to execute. We have to be better. And he's like, I disagree. But I wasn't asked a question. Among other things. Is this the same publicist for Jeff Traylor? Because it feels like, things are just...
Yeah.
You guys don't have to say what's truly on your mind. You guys can just go, you know what? We're going to need to do some different things. Nope. Poggi's it sounds like he's ripping up playbooks. He's going to figure things out. It's like, well, what were you doing the entire time? You hired these coaches. You're the one that should have been figuring out, are they getting the best out of your players? So it's mind-boggling, but seems right when your head coach is named Biff, right?
Yeah, I don't know. All right, well, I think that about wraps it up for us on the Hail Mary podcast. I'm Atoves.
I'm Toves.
We'll be back next week to review our game at Tennessee.
Birds up.